the second quintet is very much linked to the first quintet. And the first was written for Paul Rowe and the Contemporary Quartet, so it's clarinet and string quartet. And Paul had commissioned that through Music in Galway as a companion piece to Osvaldo Golijov's Dreams and Prayers of Isaac the Blind, which is a large 40-minute work for klezmer clarinet and string quartet. This is in 2010, and I started to write that piece and quite quickly was attracted to the Chaznut tradition, which is the cantorial tradition of reciting the Torah in sung verse. And the piece itself became a kind of a history of the Jewish people in a way. One of the things that tends to happen in Jewish history is that Jewish people move, often quite suddenly from one place to another, but also assimilate very quickly into the society that they find themselves. And that became a kind of a motif for the piece, that each section would start to build and then would very suddenly change and move into another one, which would then start to build. And it was only over time that the kind of general motifs would start to appear. And it was at that point that I realized that this wasn't necessarily about the Jewish people at all, it was about people in general. In 2013, I performed it myself for baritone saxophone and string quartet in Istanbul. And if you've been to Turkey or indeed any country in that neck of the woods, you've probably heard the call to prayer, which happens 5 times a day, and is this incredible polyphony where every mosque in the city just kind of erupts into sound. One of the most striking things when you hear the ezan is the call to prayer, and it's enunciated by the muezzin, who is in the minaret, in the tower, is how similar it is to the Jewish cantorial tradition. It's the same sound, it's the same modes, which in both Jewish music and the Arab world are called maqam. Maqam roughly translates as a mode, and it's kind of like the way that hummus is hummus. You know, you go anywhere, the ground is the ground. So the idea of writing the second quintet was not just in answer to the first quintet, but very much a continuation. And my idea and my feeling in writing it was to show the very deep similarities between Judaism and Islam, and in fact that they come from the same root. And one thing that I wanted to do when I was writing the second quintet was to show formally that these two pieces were related. So the first quintet starts and ends with breath. At the start of the first quintet, it's just the bow on the wood, and then it ends with the clarinet, just breath sound. The second quintet starts the same way, with the bow on the wood, and it finishes with just the accordion air bellows sound. When I was looking at the material for the second quintet, I looked at a variety of sources. One primary source was the actual call to prayer in Istanbul. So I went back to that square in Sultanahmet with recording equipment, and I recorded all 5 calls to prayer, from Fajr, the dawn prayer, through to Maghrib, the sunset prayer, and I transcribed all 5 calls, and also at that time verified the maqam of each call, and that was one of my questions actually initially when I started the research, was because the call to prayer is very clearly in maqam. It has a maqam, has a mode. And I wondered, was there a specific maqam for each time of day? I started trying to find out information about this, and I went to the Central Mosque in Paris and in London. I tried to go the kind of the academic ethnomusicological route, And I couldn't find the answer to this question. It was only in 2016 that I got the answers to this question, and we were back in Istanbul, and we were there to perform the world premiere of Sailing to Byzantium, which is a 70-minute work by a composer, Onur Turkmen. It's for large ensemble, it's a kind of a staged work, and in that ensemble there was a ney player called Miyase. Ney is the wooden flute, end-blown flute. And Miyase was a Sufi. She was part of the Mevlevi dervish sect, and she asked if we would like to come to her practice in Ankara. So we went with the other musicians, and we kind of went up to the top floor of this apartment block, and there was a large kind of room that had been made into a music room, and there were about 40 musicians in a room this size. You can't see the room, but this isn't a big room. And they performed Peshrev, which is the kind of the rite for the whirling dervishes. They did it a second time, but this time the dervishes had come in regular clothes, and they just kind of sat next to us. And I'd moved forward a little bit, and I could see the music, and I was kind of singing along. And one of the dervishes could see that I was kind of singing along, and she was like, and I really don't like spinning around, but she was very insistent, and it was kind of getting awkward, and I realized that there wasn't really much of a way out of this situation. So I was there with my wife as well, Alessia, and I was trying to get her to do it because she really does like spinning around. And she was like, no, this is like their sacred ritual, like I'm not gonna, and there's no one else doing it. And you know, this dervish was just like, and didn't speak in English either, so there was no way of explaining. So eventually we were like, okay, this is it, and we just have to get up. So, you know, we stood up, and you know, you do this, and you bow to each other, and then you start to spin, and I close my eyes, and then you kind of open your arms like that. And I was probably doing it for like maybe 30 seconds. It felt like 2 minutes, but I was like, okay, you know, I think this is cool. We'll just kind of wrap it up now. And so I opened my eyes and just immediately went like, whoa! And spun off and like hit the ground, and actually like cut my neck open and everything. And the minute I hit the ground, the 3 dervishes kind of picked me up and took me into the back room. And then they pulled out the really heavy stuff, and they were like, everyone falls the first time, and the whole world is spinning from the known into the unknown, and the atoms are spinning. And you know, I was like, can I have some water? And but they were quite insistent that I had now been initiated into the brotherhood. And we went back into the main room, and the band was still playing, and they were like, is he okay? And I was like, yeah, he's fine. And when they finished, there was this moment that hadn't happened at the end of the first one, where a solo singer, a ghazal, sang. And I heard in the sound of his voice the call to prayer. He sounded like a muezzin. And after he finished, I asked Miyase, you know, what's the story with that guy? And she was like, he had originally trained as a muezzin. So I asked him, is there an order to the maqams in the call to prayer? He was like, yeah, give me your book. And he wrote down the 5 calls to prayer and the 5 maqam in 2016. So this was kind of the end of 3 years of trying to get that answer. Once I had the answer, the piece happened quite fast. I see music as a means of coming to know the world. Like, actually the writing of the piece is a journey that you go on. And it's a means of embedding yourself in place and in history. Through, every piece that I write tends to explore a kind of a core tenet of something, whether it's, Islam or Judaism or forest ecology or, bird flocking, mathematics. It's something that I'm fascinated by, and the music is really just the excuse to study that, because when you're writing about something, it requires a very in-depth study of the field that's kind of insatiable. You're constantly trying to find out more about it, and you're following a link that this book mentions that word, and then you look up that word and you find this other book, and then you speak to somebody and then somebody has an idea. So like your whole kind of world and your ecosystem becomes a radar for discovering about this subject, whatever the subject is. And so for this one, it was kind of a year, I guess, of really writing the piece, but several years of being interested in that topic, and writing down in the notebook little kind of kernels of information when you hear it. And so me, it's kind of like, it's a way of living, really. It's a path to discovering and coming to know the world. And in the end, the music itself is kind of like just the detritus of that process. It's what's left. It's the trace. The process itself is a kind of an immersion into the chaos of a subject, where the only thing that links all these separate parts is the perception, is the observation that you are reading these details into the world. And that in itself is a very subjective experience. It's I don't even know. In Ben Dwyer's interview in Different Voices, he kind of asked that question. He says, is there a sonic signature in your different pieces, or how are they connected? And it was the first time I really thought about that, and I was like, well, actually, I suppose no. That the signature, in a way, is just a philosophical one. It's that each piece is kind of asking a question, and it's the means, it's the vocabulary of that questioning within the world, and all of the things that happen end up becoming these little details in a piece that, this whole experience of going to Istanbul and going to the dervish ceremony gives you the order of the five, and then that is kind of a stepping stone that you then move on to the next. One thing that I think is fundamental to my compositional process is that idea of experience. It's things that actually happen, that you do. And there's a lot of it is purely academic in a sense of reading books or looking at articles and questioning things in a kind of a linguistic sense. But there's also a very deep structural aspect to the process, which is about experience. The next kind of big piece I have to write is about orchids and orchid DNA, and as part of that I went last summer to Indonesia to find the habitat of the proto-orchid Nuvidia, which wasn't even flowering at the time, but just to be in this habitat where the rare orchid exists. And that was a process of a rainforest expedition, with drivers and cooks, and like a full-on kind of hiking expedition for several days just to see the orchid spike and to record its habitat. But it wasn't even necessarily about using the audio of the habitat. It was simply about the fact that you've gone through this process, and all of the little things that will happen in there will in some way filter into the actual writing process. I think actually what's happening is that the pieces are starting to cycle round and become series. When I wrote the first quintet, I had no idea that it would become part of a series. It was just this investigation into Judaism. And then 9 years later, I've just finished the second piece, which turns out to be a continuation of that one. And is, in that process, I pulled out all the old notes from the first piece, and was going through what I was going through 9 years ago, writing that. And the same thing happened with the orchid piece. That's a continuation of the forest ecology pieces from 2014 and from 2015. that at the time, obviously I hadn't realized that it was going to develop. So, I mean, there's no way in 1 year that I can exhaust the amount of information that's available for any one of the subjects. Like, I'm just scratching the surface of any one. And what is now happening, when I started a lot of those kind of big series, I was in my 20s, and now in my 30s, I'm kind of having a second iteration of a lot of those works that's coming back to them and adding to them as a series. So I think what's starting to happen more is that they're self-organizing into groups. As you continue to write a piece, you're just learning more about the initial subject.